The birth of identity. Identity is the most intimate mystery of human existence. It lives beneath every thought, every feeling, every step taken across a lifetime. It is the quiet sense of being someone, the steady presence behind the eyes, the continuous thread that says, even as years pass and everything changes, that somewhere inside there is an I who remains. But where did that sense of self begin? How did a universe made of atoms, energy, gravity, and chemistry ever arrive at a creature who could look at its own reflection and whisper, "This is me"? How did a mind become aware enough to name itself, to remember itself, to question itself, to build stories around its own existence? In this journey, we will travel back through deep time, across billions of years, through oceans of instinct, biology, and emotion, through the earliest sparks of sensation that flickered inside ancient organisms, through the rise of nervous systems, memory, and social bonds, through myth, culture, childhood, ego, and shadow, through brain networks and philosophical questions that stretch beyond science, through the future of identity itself, where humans and technology intertwine in new ways. This is the story of how the self was born. And it begins long before humans, long before mammals, long before anything with eyes or ears or voices walked the earth. To understand identity, we must begin not with thought, but with boundaries, with the first moment when life drew a line between inside and outside, between what belonged to it and what did not, between survival and dissolution, between the fragile spark of individuality and the vast world surrounding it. As we move through this exploration, allow yourself to settle. You may notice the breath moving gently in and out. You may feel your shoulders soften, your jaw relax. These small moments of awareness mirror the very subject we explore. The ability to notice ourselves, the ability to turn attention inward, even for a heartbeat, and say, yes, this is me, observing the flow of experience. Identity is not a single thing. It is a constellation, a shifting landscape made of biology, memory, emotion, culture, and imagination. It grows, transforms, protects, expands, contracts, dissolves, and re-emerges over and over again throughout life. To understand its birth, we must walk through each layer with patience, curiosity, and wonder. And so we begin. In the stillness before thought, in the ancient world before consciousness, in the depths where the first self began to form, not through words or reflection, but through the simplest and most profound distinction of all, the difference between me and not me. When you are ready, we continue our journey into the first origins of identity, the first self. Before identity became thought, emotion, or story, it began as something far more ancient, a quiet cellular decision, a boundary formed in the vastness of early Earth. In the dim oceans of billions of years ago, life emerged not with a voice or a mind, but with a membrane, a fragile wall of molecules that enclosed a tiny world within a larger one. Inside that delicate boundary, a new kind of order took shape. Outside it, chaos, danger, and opportunity flowed endlessly. In this simple separation, the earliest foundation of identity appeared. A primitive self, a presence defined not by awareness, but by distinction. This is inside. This is outside. This is what sustains me. This is what threatens me. The first organism did not think these thoughts, but it lived them. Its existence depended on maintaining that boundary, repairing it, protecting it, pushing back against dissolution. Life learned, molecule by molecule, the value of staying itself. On the early Earth, this difference between inner and outer worlds was everything. It shaped the entire future of biology. It set the stage for what would one day become desire, fear, memory, and thought. Without this first boundary, there could never have been a mind, never a story, never a human wondering who they are. And so, identity begins as survival. Imagine the ancient oceans stretching endlessly, volcanic vents carving warmth into the cold deep, minerals dancing with water, lightning striking the surface, everything raw and unformed, yet full of potential. In this world, the first cells drifted like tiny spheres of intent, simple but remarkable. The membrane was their shelter, their declaration, their difference. Through this boundary, the cell could choose. It could absorb nutrients and expel waste. It could regulate what entered and what remained outside. Even without consciousness, it displayed a form of agency, a primitive self-protection, a biological urge to remain whole. This urge was the earliest echo of I. As life evolved, that sense of biological identity grew more complex. The immune system emerged in species long before humans. It became a living record of what belonged and what did not, a guardian of the self at the molecular level. Even today, every beat of the human immune system carries this ancient whisper. This is me. This is not me. Protect what is mine. Reject what threatens. Identity is rooted not only in thought, but in the body's deepest instincts. It is written into our cells, our tissues, our rhythms of survival. Yet biology did not stop at protection. Life grew more daring. Cells formed alliances. They merged into communities, becoming multicellular organisms. This cooperation marked a profound step. Now, identity was no longer just an individual boundary. It became a collective one. Millions of cells working as one body, one self, one organism with shared survival. Identity expanded. It became layered. The rise of multicellular life created bodies with specialized roles. Some cells became guardians. Others became builders. Others explorers of the sensory world. For identity to evolve further, life needed structure, differentiation, coordination, quiet divisions of labor that allowed organisms to grow larger, stronger, more resilient. And with this complexity came new possibilities. Movement, reaction, choice. A creature that could move through its environment needed a way to sense it, a way to recognize what harmed and what nourished, a way to navigate. These were still not thoughts, but they were precursors to intention, the earliest whispers of a self acting in the world. As you listen, you might notice your own breath again, the body's gentle movement as air flows in, the subtle expansion of the chest, the way the body knows how to regulate itself without a single conscious command. This too is identity, an ancient intelligence, a living heritage from those first organisms whose survival depended on internal order. In time, evolution shaped more sophisticated systems. The first neural networks appeared in simple organisms, barely more than threads of living tissue. And yet, they carried something monumental, the capacity to process information, to respond to the world with increasing complexity, to make decisions that were no longer purely chemical. This was the dawn of agency. With every new adaptation, life refined the boundary between self and environment, between internal states and external forces, between what it was and what it was becoming. These early organisms did not yet have consciousness, but they had something vital: stability. They maintained themselves against the tide of entropy. They persisted. They held their identity, however primitive, across time. And from this persistence, evolution had the raw material it needed to craft minds. When simple organisms became able to sense their surroundings, the world expanded. When they developed the ability to store information about those surroundings, the world changed again. And when they evolved the capacity to act based on those memories, the earliest seeds of a conscious self were planted. But all of this rests on that original truth. Identity was born from the tension between order and chaos, between the fragile interior of the first living cell and the vast, unpredictable world outside it. Without that boundary, the self could never have emerged. Every heartbeat of identity begins here. We pause in this ancient ocean, letting the significance of that moment settle like sediment drifting to the sea floor. The first self was not aware. It did not think. It did not dream. But it held a place in the universe, a position that separated it from everything it was not. From this smallest division, the vast story of identity would eventually unfold. From here, we move forward into a world where sensation awakens, where memory forms, where awareness begins to flicker inside living creatures for the first time. The journey from a protected boundary to a feeling being. And so we continue. Awareness emerges. Before the mind could dream, before a creature could look at its surroundings with curiosity or fear, there had to be sensation. Awareness did not burst into existence fully formed. It rose slowly, like the first faint glow of dawn spreading across a silent horizon. It began with the simplest signals: a change in temperature, a shift in pressure, a touch against the membrane of a tiny organism drifting through ancient water. These signals were not experienced the way humans experience sensation. There were no thoughts, no colors, no sounds, no stories. But they mattered. They allowed a creature to move toward what nourished and away from what harmed. They created patterns of reaction. They shaped behavior. And in doing so, they formed the earliest roots of awareness. To feel, in the beginning, was simply to survive. As life continued to evolve, these patterns became more refined. Some organisms developed clusters of specialized cells, able to detect light, chemicals, or vibrations. These were the first sensory systems, primitive but powerful. Through them, life learned that the world had structure, that it was not random, but filled with signals waiting to be interpreted. Imagine a tiny organism sensing light for the first time. It does not see in the human sense, but it detects direction. It senses warmth, it moves, it acts. This action is not yet intention. It is a reflexive dance between stimulus and response. Yet within this dance, something profound is unfolding. A creature is beginning to experience the world. As you listen, you might allow yourself to take one slow breath, noticing how your own senses gather information: the air on the skin, the weight of the body, the faint sounds around you. These sensations are the descendants of that ancient moment when life learned to feel. Over millions of years, sensation grew richer. Neural networks expanded. Specialized cells communicated with one another. Patterns formed. Each innovation allowed organisms to map their surroundings with greater clarity. And with this mapping came a new capacity: prediction. Prediction was a turning point in evolution. When an organism could not only react but anticipate, something shifted in the architecture of life. A creature could prepare. It could move before danger arrived. It could hunt more effectively. It could survive not only because of what it sensed in the present, but because of what it expected in the future. Prediction created time within the mind: a before, a now, a next. This sequence formed the groundwork for memory. Memory allowed the past to influence the present. It allowed organisms to associate certain stimuli with certain outcomes. Pain meant danger. Warmth meant nourishment. Movement meant opportunity. It was here, in this merging of sensation and memory, that the first faint sparks of awareness began to glow. Awareness is not simply knowing what is happening. It is the ability to register experience, to hold it, even briefly, within the inner space of an organism. And as memory strengthened, this inner space grew wider, deeper, more connected. The rise of memory gave birth to preference, not emotion yet, but bias, a tendency toward familiar patterns, toward what had worked before. This bias, though simple, was a subtle form of identity. A creature's behavior became shaped not only by its environment, but by its history. In time, nervous systems evolved into more elaborate structures. Entire networks of neurons coordinated movement, sensation, and internal regulation. These early neural architectures created something revolutionary, a centralized way of making sense of the world. The first brains were small, no larger than grains of sand, but they could integrate information. They could coordinate responses. They could create coherence between what the organism sensed and how it acted. This was the earliest emergence of mind. The world became not only a place of raw chemical interaction, but a landscape of meaning. Signals were interpreted, processed, weighed. A creature began to respond to patterns rather than isolated events. It began to live not just in reaction, but in relation. And with relation came the first whispers of self. To relate to the world, an organism had to differentiate its own internal states from external stimuli. It had to know, in some primordial way, what belonged to its inner world: hunger, tension, energy, and what came from outside: light, heat, movement. This separation created the first primitive form of subjective experience. Not consciousness as humans know it, but the beginning of something that would eventually grow into consciousness. As evolution progressed, the animal kingdom expanded into rich forms. Marine creatures developed complex eyes capable of perceiving shapes. Insects evolved antennae that detected chemical trails. Early vertebrates formed brains with dedicated regions for sensation, movement, and memory. The world became brighter, louder, richer in detail, and the mind expanded to meet it. Awareness grew from simple detection to multi-layered experience. Animals began to navigate not only through sensory information, but through internal states. Hunger drove them. Curiosity guided them. Aversion shaped their routes and choices. And though these experiences were not yet reflective, they were felt in a deep and primal way. Imagine an early fish swimming through ancient oceans, sensing shifts in water pressure, flashes of light, chemical traces of food. Its brain processes this information in real time. It remembers where nourishment was found before. It recognizes the movement patterns of predators. It acts with a blend of instinct, sensation, and memory. This creature does not know itself as a self, but it is closer than anything that came before. Awareness is layered. It grows like sediment in a riverbed, each generation adding complexity to what came before. Over time, simple awareness of the environment evolved into awareness of internal experience, and eventually into awareness of awareness itself. This unfolding was not quick. It spanned millions of years. Life tested countless forms and functions. Nervous systems branched, merged, intensified. Some species evolved extraordinary sensory abilities. Others developed intricate communication. All of them contributed to the rising tide of awareness that would one day culminate in conscious beings. As we reach the end of this chapter, allow a brief moment to notice your own experience again. The breath, the body, the subtle awareness of being here, listening, sensing. This gentle noticing echoes the evolutionary journey that brought awareness into existence. From sensation came memory. From memory came experience. From experience came prediction. And from prediction came the early architecture of mind. Now, identity had its foundation. A mind that could sense and remember was a mind ready for the next great leap. Emotion. In the next chapter, we explore how feelings shaped the early sense of self, how fear, joy, attraction, and attachment carved the pathways that would later become personality and intention, how emotion became the vital force that gave identity not just structure, but color. We continue. Emotion and identity. Long before language, long before reflection, emotion was the heartbeat of identity. It pulsed through early nervous systems with a raw and urgent clarity. Emotion arrived as one of evolution's most powerful inventions. It shaped behavior. It guided survival. It forged the first inner landscapes that organisms would navigate, not just with sensation, but with feeling. Emotion is the bridge between biology and experience. It transforms simple awareness into something meaningful. It turns a stimulus into a signal, a moment into a memory, a world into a place of desire, fear, comfort, and avoidance. In the beginning, emotion was simple, more like tides than storms, more like currents than thoughts. Yet, even in these early forms, emotion carried a kind of intelligence. Not conscious intelligence, but functional intelligence. A way for life to choose more efficiently, to act with greater precision, to shape the continuity of its own existence. Imagine the earliest creatures responding to pain. Pain was not a conscious suffering, but a reflexive alarm, a signal that something threatened the integrity of their bodies. Pain said, "Move away, protect yourself, change your behavior." This was one of emotion's primal voices. Pleasure emerged alongside pain. Pleasure guided organisms toward nourishment, warmth, safety, and reproduction. It encouraged repetition of behaviors that sustained life. It whispered a simple but powerful instruction. Move towards what supports you. These basic emotional currents laid the groundwork for motivation, for choice, for patterns of behavior that would eventually become personality traits. As nervous systems grew more complex, emotions diversified. Fear became more nuanced. It evolved from a single reflex into a spectrum of responses. Startle, freeze, flee, fight, appraise, prepare. All of these reactions served one purpose: survival. But they also shaped the internal life of the organism. They created an internal world that could be felt, even if not yet consciously understood. If you pause for a moment and gently feel your own breath, you may notice echoes of these ancient emotional rhythms. The rise and fall of tension, the warmth of calm, the subtle shift when something feels safe or unsafe. These patterns are millions of years old, carried forward through every generation of nervous systems. Emotion is not an add-on to identity, it is its foundation. Through emotion, organisms learned to value certain experiences over others. They developed preferences. A preference is a kind of identity. It is a declaration of what matters, what draws you in, what you avoid, what you move toward. Life learned to sculpt itself around these patterns. In early mammals, emotions grew richer still. The limbic system evolved as a powerful emotional engine. It brought with it deeper bonding, more sophisticated fear responses, and the roots of what humans now know as affection, curiosity, play, longing, and grief. Attachment is one of the most transformative emotional innovations in evolutionary history. It appeared in early mammals as a way to keep young alive. But with it came something more profound, the beginning of relational identity. A young mammal did not merely recognize food or warmth, it recognized a caregiver, a presence, a source of safety. This recognition, this emotional imprint, became a model for how that organism would interact with others for the rest of its life. Even in animals without language, this early bond formed a sense of belonging, a sense of being connected to something beyond the physical body, a sense of being part of a shared emotional world. This was identity stretching outward. Emotion wove organisms into relationships. It shaped social groups. It gave rise to hierarchies, alliances, families, tribes. And every one of these social structures required individuals to understand, at least in some primal way, their place within the group. This sense of place, of being one part of a larger whole, was a key step in the development of self-awareness. To belong, an organism needed to navigate complex emotions: attraction, rivalry, affection, submission, aggression. These emotional interactions taught individuals not only about others, but about themselves. Even without reflection, emotion created internal distinctions. The creature that felt dominant sensed itself differently from the creature that felt vulnerable. The one that felt cared for knew safety. The one that felt abandoned learned fear. Emotions sculpted the earliest contours of identity. In time, emotions became intertwined with memory. Fear memories allowed organisms to avoid danger in the future. Pleasure memories guided them toward opportunities. Bonding memories created loyalty and attachment. Emotional memories did more than help survival. They created continuity, a sense of experiencing life across time. Continuity is the essence of identity. To feel something and remember it is to carry a part of oneself forward. It is to become a story, even before words existed. The creature who once felt fear in a particular environment carried that memory like an internal compass. The one who felt warmth in the presence of another carried that warmth into future interactions. Emotion created a narrative structure long before language could articulate it. Emotions also became the seeds of intentionality. A desire is an emotional movement towards something. An aversion is a movement away. Over generations, these emotional orientations created more refined internal maps. Organisms learned to balance competing emotions: hunger against fear, curiosity against caution, comfort against exploration. These internal negotiations laid the foundation for what humans later call decision-making. Emotion was the earliest decision-maker. As mammalian brains grew more sophisticated, emotions gained layers. Complex social species like primates developed empathy, compassion, playfulness, even rudimentary guilt. These emotions allowed individuals to read the emotional states of others, to predict how others might act, to respond in kind. This was the beginning of emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence is inseparable from identity. It teaches an organism how to behave in social contexts, how to understand its own impulses, how to harmonize with or resist the group. It shapes patterns of relating that become part of who that organism is. If you pause for another moment, perhaps soften the eyes or relax the shoulders, you might notice how your own emotional history has shaped your identity. Certain reactions feel familiar. Certain patterns feel natural. These patterns are the architecture of your emotional self. Emotion gives identity its texture, its depth, its warmth, its vulnerability. Without emotion, identity would be a flat map, devoid of meaning. With emotion, identity becomes alive. It becomes a dynamic interplay between inner experience and outer world. And so, as emotion matured in evolutionary history, it prepared the stage for something extraordinary, a leap that would change the trajectory of identity forever. Social awareness. The ability not only to feel internally, but to recognize oneself as a being among other beings. A participant in a shared emotional and behavioral landscape. This shift would lead to recognition, bonding, imitation, cooperation, and the earliest forms of self-awareness. Emotion opened the door. Social minds stepped through it. In the next chapter, we explore mirrors, social cognition, connection, and the astonishing rise of the social self. Mirrors and social minds. Identity deepened when creatures began to see themselves through others. Long before mirrors of glass existed, life discovered its first reflective surfaces in the eyes, gestures, and reactions of companions. To be social was to be shaped by relationship. To be social was to live inside a world where the self was no longer contained within one body, but extended across bonds, signals, and shared experiences. The rise of social living transformed the very structure of the mind. It created a new dimension of identity. A creature was no longer defined solely by its internal sensations or private emotions. It was also shaped by how others responded to it, how they moved around it, how they signaled threat, comfort, welcome, or rejection. In this new landscape, awareness expanded. Imagine the early social mammals moving in herds, packs, or small family groups. They were no longer solitary beings responding only to hunger, fear, or curiosity. Now, their survival depended on reading the emotional states of others, on anticipating the group's movements, on harmonizing with collective behavior. This was the origin of social cognition. Social cognition required a profound evolutionary innovation, a brain capable of understanding not just one's own internal states, but the states of other minds. This capacity did not emerge overnight. It took millions of years of social interaction, conflict, cooperation, caregiving, play, and communication for animals to develop minds capable of modeling the intentions and emotions of others. Every species that survived through social coordination began cultivating these abilities. Primates refined them. Early humans expanded them dramatically. But before humans, before complex language or symbolic culture, there were gestures, touches, voices, patterns of movement that carried meaning. These early social signals acted like emotional mirrors. They allowed individuals to see themselves reflected back in the reactions of others. A creature that growled and watched its opponent retreat learned something about its power. A creature that cried and was comforted learned something about its vulnerability. A creature that played and elicited joy learned something about connection. Identity grew through these interactions, shaped by the subtle feedback loops of social behavior. Even infants of many species display early forms of this relational awareness. A young mammal often orients toward the gaze of its parent. It responds to tone. It reacts to emotion. These are not conscious reflections, but they are seeds of recognition. Seeds of the capacity to understand the self in relation to others. If you pause for a moment and gently notice your breath, You might also become aware of how deeply relational your own identity feels. How much of who you are is shaped by the people who saw you, responded to you, held you, challenged you, or misunderstood you. The social mind is not an add-on. It is the architecture of the human experience. As social species evolved, one of the most extraordinary neural systems emerged. A system that allowed organisms not only to read the emotions of others, but to internally simulate them. These were the mirror neurons. Mirror neurons fired when an animal performed an action and when it observed another performing the same action. They allowed the mind to resonate with the world. They created an internal echo of the behavior, emotion, or intention of another being. Through this resonance, identity expanded. A creature could feel another's experience within its own nervous system. Mirror neurons paved the way for empathy. With empathy came cooperation, protection, teaching, shared intention. The emotional resonance between individuals became a powerful evolutionary force. It created alliances that were more stable, families that were more cohesive, communities that could transmit learned behaviors from one generation to the next. Identity was now woven into the social fabric. For early humans, this social mind became the foundation of everything that followed. Our ancestors formed groups not merely for safety, but for emotional and cognitive development. Infant humans are born remarkably helpless, requiring years of care. This prolonged dependency created a rich environment for early social learning. Every look, every sound, every touch, every expression from a caregiver shaped the infant's developing brain. These early experiences carved deep pathways into the architecture of identity. They taught the infant who they were in the eyes of others. They taught them what behaviors evoked love, comfort, or attention. They taught them how to attune to emotional cues. These experiences created the earliest personal templates of self. Social minds also learned from the group. They absorbed norms, rituals, behaviors, and expectations. They developed roles. Some individuals became leaders. Others became nurturers. Others became protectors, explorers, or mediators. Each role shaped a unique sense of self. Identity became differentiated within the group. But the most transformative leap in social cognition occurred when a creature first recognized itself. Not just as part of a group, not just as a participant in relationships, but as an individual, unique, continuous, and self-contained. This moment remains one of the most mysterious leaps in evolutionary history. For some animals, this recognition arises in the mirror test. When they look at their reflection and understand that the image is not another creature, but themselves. Humans, great apes, dolphins, elephants, and some birds have demonstrated this ability. The mirror test is not a perfect measure of self-awareness, but it marks a fascinating cognitive threshold. A creature capable of recognizing itself has crossed into a new dimension of identity. It has developed the capacity to create an internal representation of itself, separate from others. This is the beginning of reflective self-awareness. Human infants typically reach this stage around 18 months of age. Before that, they treat their reflection as another person. But once self-recognition emerges, something profound changes in their behavior. They begin to explore themselves in new ways. They touch their faces. They experiment with gestures. They look at their reflection with curiosity. This early self-recognition is a milestone in identity development. Yet, even before the mirror test, infants demonstrate complex forms of social awareness. They mimic expressions, respond to tone, and engage in reciprocal interactions. These abilities reveal that identity is not formed in isolation. It emerges within relationship long before it becomes reflective. As humans evolved, social cognition expanded into an extraordinary capacity, the ability to imagine the mental states of others. This capacity is known as theory of mind. It allows a person to understand that others have thoughts, beliefs, desires, and emotions different from their own. Theory of mind transformed human identity. It allowed humans to participate in shared intention. It allowed them to cooperate toward goals that extended beyond individual survival. It allowed them to negotiate, to deceive, to comfort, to teach, to imagine. It also allowed humans to compare themselves to others. And comparison is one of the most powerful forces shaping identity. Social minds learn who they are, not only from inner experience, but from observing others. They see themselves in relation to siblings, peers, and elders. They internalize expectations. They begin to form a sense of how they fit into the world. Identity becomes relational. Every social interaction acts as a mirror. Some mirrors show us parts of ourselves we embrace. Others reveal parts we resist. Each one shapes the evolving story of who we believe ourselves to be. As this chapter draws to a close, you may choose to notice the subtle presence of your own social identity. The roles you have played, the faces that shaped you, the echoes of voices and expectations that live within your mind. These experiences, too, are mirrors. From social minds, identity gained depth. Emotion connected individuals to their inner world. Social cognition connected them to others. But something was still missing. One of the most powerful tools ever invented by evolution: language. With language, identity would transform again. It would move from sensation, emotion, and relationship into story, into memory shaped by words, into narratives that stretch across time, into the ability to say not only "I am," but "I was" and "I will be." Language would allow identity to become a tale, a living, unfolding biography. And so we continue. Language and personal story. Identity shifted again the moment language entered the world. With language, the human mind gained a new dimension, a bridge between inner experience and external expression, a tool that allowed intangible thoughts to become tangible sound. Language turned sensations into symbols. It turned memories into stories. It turned vague emotional histories into structured narratives that could be shared, remembered, altered, and inherited. Before language, communication existed in gestures, expressions, vocal calls, and rhythmic patterns. These signals carried emotion and intention, but they were limited. They conveyed what was happening now. Language changed everything by allowing humans to speak about what happened before and what might happen in the future. The moment humans gained this ability, identity expanded far beyond the present moment. A new self emerged, a temporal self, a being stretched across time. Imagine the first ancestors sitting around ancient fires. They shared stories of hunts, dangers, migrations, births, and deaths. These stories carried more than information. They carried identity. They told each person where they came from, what their roles were, what their ancestors had accomplished, and what their community valued. In these early gatherings, the narrative self began to take shape. Language allowed humans to name themselves, to name others, to describe their thoughts, emotions, and desires, to articulate dreams, to confess fears, to declare loyalties, to challenge, question, imagine, invent, or transform. Identity gains structure through words. A child born into a language-rich world learned to think within that language. Words shaped how they understood emotions, how they classified the world, how they described their own inner experience. Without language, feelings might exist as raw sensations. With language, those sensations could be named, known, shared, reflected upon. To name an emotion is to create a place for it inside the self. Language became the scaffold for memory. Humans learned to organize experiences into coherent sequences. What happened first? What happened next? Who was involved? Why it mattered? This ordering created continuity. It wove events into meaning, and meaning is one of identity's most powerful foundations. If you pause for a moment and gently notice the flow of your breath, you may also notice how your mind naturally narrates your life. It tells you what you are doing. It explains what you feel. It predicts what might come. This quiet inner narrator is a direct descendant of the first storytellers who sat around ancient fires. The ability to tell stories gave humans a unique evolutionary advantage. Stories helped coordinate groups. They preserved knowledge. They carried emotional lessons across generations. But stories also shape the self internally. A person became the story they told about themselves. This story is not always conscious. It forms in fragments, in childhood experiences, in cultural expectations, in memories repeated often enough to become myth, in moments that carry emotional weight. Language gives these fragments coherence. Once a person can tell a story about themselves, the story becomes a lens. It influences how they interpret new experiences. It shapes their sense of possibility. It defines their patterns of behavior. This self-story can empower, it can soothe. It can also imprison if the story becomes too narrow or too rigid. Identity becomes a narrative landscape. And this landscape continues to evolve throughout life. Language allows people to revise their stories, to reinterpret memories, to reframe trauma, to discover new meanings, to shed old identities and create new ones. Without language, identity would be far more static. With language, identity becomes dynamic, adaptable, open to transformation. Language also made abstract identity possible. Humans could now describe values, beliefs, and principles. They could say, I am brave, or I'm afraid, or I am loyal, or I am lost. These abstract self-descriptions allowed identity to stretch beyond immediate experience. They allowed people to imagine themselves across situations they had never encountered. They allowed individuals to adopt roles, aspirations, and ideals. Language also allowed the emergence of self-reflection, the ability to ask questions like, who am I? Why do I feel this way? What is my purpose? Before language, these questions could not be formed. With language, they became central to human consciousness. Reflection deepened identity further. People could examine their own thoughts. They could observe their internal experiences. They could make decisions based not only on emotion or instinct, but on self-understanding. Language also created the shared identity of cultures. Myths, legends, rituals, and belief systems all required language to flourish. Through these shared stories, communities created collective identities. These identities gave individuals a sense of belonging, a place in the world that tied them to something larger than themselves. Stories became the glue of societies. Language made it possible for a person to live not only within their own body, but within cultural narratives. These narratives shape beliefs about who one should be, how one should act, and what one should value. They offered ideals. They imposed norms. They created meaning. Identity became both personal and collective. As humans mastered language, they also began to create symbols. Symbols allowed ideas to exist independently of objects. A drawing could represent the sun. A carving could represent a deity. A sound could represent a tribe. Symbols allowed identity to be preserved across time, transported across distance, and transformed across generations. With symbols came writing, and with writing came the ability to solidify stories, to make identity durable, to crystallize memories into something that could outlive the individual. Writing extended identity into permanence. Human beings could now leave behind stories that shaped the identities of descendants. While language and story gave identity form, they also created its complexity. Humans could now reflect on contradictions within themselves. They could experience inner conflict. They could chase ideals they struggled to live up to. They could imagine versions of themselves that differed from the present. Identity became fluid, evolving, often unstable, but endlessly rich. As this chapter settles, you may notice again the presence of your own inner narrator, the voice that tells you who you are, the voice shaped by your childhood, your culture, your memories, your hopes. This voice is not fixed. It shifts, it learns, it grows, and it is one of the most profound products of language. Language turned identity into story. Story turned identity into a lifelong journey. The next chapter brings the story inward into the world of childhood, into the earliest years when the foundations of the personal identity take shape. The years in which attachment, emotion, memory, and environment weave together to create the first version of I. We continue. Childhood identity. Identity takes its first human shape in childhood. Before a child can describe themselves with words, before they can name their emotions or explain their thoughts, they are already forming the earliest version of I. This early identity emerges not through concepts, but through relationships, through touch, through the presence of caregivers, through the rhythms of trust, safety, exploration, and the quiet emotional imprints that settle into the developing nervous system. A newborn does not arrive with a story. They arrive with sensations, warmth, hunger, sound, light, a heartbeat not their own, but familiar from the womb. Their earliest moments are woven from these sensations, and each one carries meaning long before the child can understand meaning intellectually. The infant's first identity is relational. Imagine a newborn lying against a caregiver's chest. The sound of a steady heartbeat, the warmth of skin, the gentle rhythm of breathing, the soft sway of movement. All of these signals communicate safety. In the earliest weeks of life, safety is identity. The child's nervous system learns its first lesson. When I am held, I exist in peace. When I am comforted, I am seen. When I am responded to, I am someone who matters. These early responses shape the architecture of the infant's brain. Neural pathways strengthen with every moment of connection. Oxytocin flows with each loving interaction. The child begins to form a foundational belief that the world can be trusted, and within that trust, a small but vital sense of self begins to grow. Identity begins with attachment. Check. Attachment is more than emotional closeness. It is a biological conversation between caregiver and child. The caregiver regulates the infant's stress. The caregiver becomes the external nervous system, while the child's own system is still learning its patterns. When a child cries and is soothed, their brain learns that distress leads to comfort. When they are hungry and fed, their brain learns that needs lead to fulfillment. Over time, these patterns organize into an internal model of self. A child who is consistently soothed begins to feel worthy of soothing. A child who is consistently seen begins to feel visible. A child who is consistently protected begins to feel safe. These early emotional lessons form the roots of identity. They are not taught consciously. They are not articulated. They are absorbed into the nervous system through repetition, through the quiet reliability of care. If you take a gentle breath now, you might notice how your own emotional rhythms echo the patterns shaped in your early years. The way you seek comfort, the way you respond to stress, the way you trust or hesitate. These behaviors are reflections of your earliest identity, carried forward through time. As children grow, their cognitive abilities expand. They begin to recognize patterns in the world. They develop object permanence, understanding that something still exists even when unseen. This breakthrough allows the child to form more complex relationships with people. A caregiver who leaves the room still exists, and if they exist, they hold a place in the child's emerging story. This is where separation becomes meaningful. Separation teaches the child that they are not the same as the caregiver, that they have their own body, their own experiences, their own desires. This distinction deepens identity. The child begins to form a sense of individuality, even if only in fleeting, pre-verbal glimpses. Toddlerhood brings a remarkable shift. Language begins to blossom. The child learns words like mine, no, me, and I. These words mark the earliest verbal expressions of self-concept. They reflect a growing awareness that the child is a distinct being, not just part of a caregiver's world, but a person with preferences, boundaries, and agency. Agency becomes one of the defining elements of childhood identity. The toddler begins to test their environment. They reach for independence. They explore. They want to climb, run, touch, taste, and experience everything. This exploration is not defiance. It is identity-seeking expression. Each new experience adds to the child's internal model of who they are. Children also begin to imitate. They mimic gestures, voices, behaviors, and emotions. Through imitation, they learn social roles. They absorb values. They begin to internalize cultural norms. The child forms a sense of, people like me do things like this. Imitation is one of the earliest forms of story writing. The child borrows pieces of identity from the people around them and weaves them into the beginnings of their own character. But childhood identity is not shaped only by love and learning. It is also shaped by emotion, both pleasant and distressing. A child who is comforted when frustrated learns that frustration is tolerable. A child who is shamed for expressing fear may learn that fear must be hidden. These emotional lessons carve deep grooves into the developing self. Personality traits begin to emerge. Some children become bold explorers, confident in their safety. Others become cautious observers, shaped by environments that felt unpredictable. Some find joy in social interaction. Others seek solitude. These tendencies are not fixed destinies, but early patterns that influence the trajectory of identity. Memory also begins to take a new shape in early childhood. Episodic memory, the ability to recall specific events, emerges around age 3. Before this, Children experience life but cannot structure it into lasting autobiographical stories. With episodic memory, the child begins to build the earliest chapters of their narrative identity. They remember moments, the color of a favorite toy, the warmth of a parent's touch, a frightening noise, a joyful game. These memories, though simple, become the foundations of the life story the child will one day expand with words, reflection, and meaning. Childhood also introduces roles. Siblings create hierarchies. Families create expectations. Schools introduce comparisons. Roles shape identity by teaching children how they fit into social environments. The oldest child may feel responsible. The youngest may feel playful or dependent. The child who is praised for kindness may begin to build identity around compassion. The one praised for intelligence may become defined by curiosity or achievement. Identity becomes a negotiation between the inner world and the outer world. As children continue to grow, they refine their sense of self through play. Play is not mere entertainment. It is the laboratory of identity. In play, children experiment with roles: hero, caregiver, explorer, leader. They test boundaries. They try on behaviors. They create imaginary worlds that allow them to explore fear, bravery, conflict, and resolution. Through play, they learn who they might become. If you pause again and notice your breath, you may feel the distance between who you were as a child and who you became. And yet, the earliest threads of your identity still run through your inner life. The ways you relate, the ways you cope, the ways you dream, all trace back to those early years when the world was new and the self was just beginning to form. Childhood identity is a foundation, not a final form. It sets the stage for the next chapter in the story of self. The chapter in which the mind becomes more complex, more protective, more self-defining. The rise of ego. In the next chapter, we explore how the ego develops as a guardian of identity, how it protects the self, shapes boundaries, interprets experience, and crafts the inner world that follows each person through life. We continue. The rise of ego. As children grow into early adolescence, something remarkable happens within the architecture of identity. The self, once fluid and purely relational, begins to crystallize into a more defined structure. This structure is not rigid, but it is organized. It is protective. It is attentive to the world and how the world responds. It is the ego. The ego is often misunderstood. In many conversations, it is spoken of as something inflated, selfish, or flawed. But in its essence, the ego is simply the child of identity and experience. It is the psychological system that helps us understand who we are, what we can do, and how we fit into the world. The ego arises from the need to interpret reality, to maintain boundaries, to protect vulnerability, and to navigate the complex social landscapes of human life. It is not the enemy of the self, it is the guardian of the self. Imagine a child who has reached an age where they can reflect more clearly on their own abilities. They look at the world and begin forming judgments about themselves. Am I strong? Am I kind? Am I good? Am I smart? Am I worthy? These judgments grow from earlier emotional imprints, but now gain structure through language, memory, and social feedback. The ego organizes these judgments into an internal framework, a map of identity. This map helps the child predict how they will be treated. It guides their behavior. It shapes their expectations of themselves and others. It tells them where they belong and where they do not, what they are capable of and what they fear, what they deserve, and what they must protect. The ego is the mind's way of forming continuity between past and future. As the brain matures, cognitive abilities expand. Children become more aware of themselves as separate beings, not only physically but psychologically. They start comparing themselves to peers. They notice differences in temperament, talent, and personality. These comparisons become part of the ego's early architecture. Children also become more aware of social rules. They learn what is acceptable, what brings approval, what invites criticism, and what triggers conflict. The ego adapts to these lessons by creating strategies. A child who is praised for being quiet may develop a cautious, gentle ego. A child rewarded for assertiveness may build a bold, confident one. A child punished for vulnerability may learn to hide their emotions behind a protective mask. Identity begins to solidify through adaptation. The ego learns to manage internal experiences as well. When a child feels fear, sadness, or shame, the ego tries to make sense of these emotions. It creates explanations, stories, rationalizations. These stories may not always be accurate, but they serve a purpose: to help the mind maintain coherence, to help the child navigate a world that can feel overwhelming. This is where the ego's protective functions become essential. If you take a moment now, perhaps noticing your breath settling gently in the body, you may recognize your own ego's tendencies. The parts of you that guard your vulnerabilities, the parts that seek recognition, the parts that fear rejection or failure. These patterns are not flaws. They are responses shaped across years of psychological negotiation. As children move into adolescence, the ego becomes more pronounced. This is a period of heightened emotional intensity, expanding social circles, and increased self-consciousness. Adolescents begin to form independent identities, separate from their families. They explore different roles, challenge norms, and seek belonging outside the home. These transitions test the ego's strength and flexibility. The adolescent ego becomes a storyteller. It experiments with different narratives, trying to discover which one feels true. It switches between idealism and insecurity, between boldness and caution, between belonging and rebellion. This shifting is not instability. It is identity, forming itself through trial, error, and exploration. The ego forces the young person to ask deep questions. Who am I? Who should I become? Who must I be to be accepted? Who can I be when I am free? These questions carve identity like a sculptor shaping stone. To navigate these questions, the ego develops psychological defenses. These defenses are not inherently negative. They are tools. Each serves a function. Some soften pain. Some preserve dignity. Some protect against overwhelming emotion. Some help the young mind adapt to social pressure. Denial prevents the ego from being crushed by truths it cannot yet face. Projection allows uncomfortable feelings to be seen outside the self, where they feel safer. Repression hides experiences that were too difficult to process at the time. Rationalization gives uncomfortable events a coherent explanation, even if the explanation is incomplete. These defenses become part of the ego's architecture. They influence how the person interprets the world, how they respond to challenge, how they relate to others. Each defense shapes identity by creating habits of thought, emotion, and behavior. But the ego is not only a protector, it is also a builder. As the adolescent brain continues to mature, new layers of self-awareness emerge. The ability to observe one's own thoughts, the capacity to reflect on personal motives, the skill to imagine future versions of oneself. These abilities empower the ego to construct a sense of purpose, a direction, a personal narrative that reaches beyond immediate experience. This narrative becomes the blueprint of the adult identity. In early adulthood, the ego begins to refine itself. Individuals test their abilities in the wider world. They form intimate relationships, pursue careers, make decisions that shape their long-term trajectory. Every success strengthens the ego's confidence. Every setback challenges its resilience. Each experience tests the stories the ego has been building since childhood. Over time, the ego becomes more nuanced. It learns humility. It learns flexibility. It learns to tolerate contradiction. It learns that identity is complex and that no single story can capture the fullness of a human life. And yet, even in adulthood, the ego remains vigilant. It monitors boundaries. It reacts to threats. It interprets social cues. It creates continuity between who we were yesterday and who we believe we will be tomorrow. In moments of quiet, you might notice the ego speaking softly within you. The part of your mind that says, "This is who I am," or "I must protect this part of myself," or "I want to be seen this way." These internal whispers are echoes of the ego's lifelong work. The ego is not the final form of identity, but it is one of its most essential layers. Without ego, we would have no sense of agency, no sense of individuality, no capacity for self-regulation or self-preservation. The ego is the foundation upon which deeper understanding of identity is built. But identity does not exist only within the individual. It is shaped by a wider world. Culture, tradition, society, and collective meaning all contribute to the story of who we are. The next chapter expands the lens outward. It explores how identity transforms when the self meets the collective. How rituals, symbols, norms, and shared stories shape the individual from childhood into adulthood. How culture becomes one of the greatest sculptors of the self. We continue. Identity and culture. Identity is never formed in isolation. Even the most private sense of self is shaped by forces that existed long before our birth. Language, ritual, tradition, values. Stories pass through generations. The invisible atmosphere of meaning that surrounds us from the moment we enter the world. Culture is the great sculptor, carving out shared identities while shaping the identities of individuals within its reach. To understand who we are, we must understand the cultural waters we swim in. Every gesture, belief, role, and aspiration carries traces of those waters. Culture does more than influence identity. It provides the blueprint for it. Imagine a newborn entering the world. They do not yet know the language spoken around them. They do not recognize symbols, customs, or social expectations. And yet, from the very first moment, they are woven into a network of meaning. They inherit a world of assumptions before they can even understand a single word. This world becomes the backdrop for the identity they will form. Culture offers the first materials with which a child crafts their sense of self. Their name, for instance, is not something they choose. It is chosen for them, often with significance rooted in tradition, ancestry, or aspiration. Their name becomes the first symbol they carry, a sound that summons their presence and marks their belonging. Names anchor identity within cultural memory. As children grow, they learn cultural scripts. These scripts tell them what behaviors are admired, what behaviors are discouraged, what virtues are valued, and what roles they are expected to play. These scripts vary across societies, but their influence is universal. Some cultures value independence. Others value interdependence. Some prize assertiveness. Others prize humility. Some celebrate individual achievement. Others celebrate collective harmony. Some idealize youth. Others venerate age and wisdom. Children absorb these values long before they can articulate them. Through gestures, expressions, tone, and the emotional responses of caregivers and communities, they learn what it means to be a good member of their culture. These early lessons become part of identity's foundation. If you pause for a moment and gently observe your breath, you might also sense how deeply cultural expectations live within you. The way you think about success, the way you judge failure, the way you relate to authority, family, relationships, ambition, or rest. These patterns reflect not only your personality, but your cultural inheritance. Culture also shapes identity through rituals. Rituals mark transitions: birth, coming of age, marriage, parenthood, death. These rituals are more than symbolic acts. They act as psychological anchors. They help individuals move from one identity to another. A child becomes a member of the community. A youth becomes an adult. A couple becomes a family. A person facing loss becomes a mourner, held by tradition, guided by collective meaning. Rituals remind individuals that identity is part of a larger story. Communities reinforce identity through shared symbols: a flag, a song, a myth, a sacred object, a belief system. Each symbol carries emotional weight. These symbols bind individuals together, creating a sense of belonging that transcends personal history. Belonging is one of the most powerful forces shaping identity. Humans are social creatures. They seek connection, acceptance, and meaning in shared narratives. Cultural belonging creates safety. It also creates purpose. Through belonging, a person feels seen not only as an individual, but as part of something larger. Culture also transmits norms that shape identity development. Norms influence behavior, even when they are not consciously recognized. They shape the roles people play within their families, communities, and institutions. In some cultures, identity is defined through lineage. In others, through personal achievement. In some, through spiritual devotion. In others, through profession or skill. Identity becomes a negotiation between the self and the expectations of the collective. Stories play a central role in this negotiation. Every culture tells stories about what makes life meaningful. These stories become mirrors in which individuals see themselves. Myths, legends, historical narratives, and religious teachings all shape the values a culture cherishes. They offer behavioral models. They present ideals to aspire to and warnings to avoid. A child raised on stories of courage may internalize bravery as a virtue. A child raised on stories of humility may internalize modesty as a guiding principle. A child raised on stories of divine purpose may build identity around spiritual calling. Cultural stories seep into personal stories. They form the backdrop against which individuals define themselves. Culture also shapes identity through roles. Every society has roles: parent, worker, leader, mentor, protector, artist, healer. These roles guide how individuals behave and how they are treated. People often internalize these roles as part of their identity, often without realizing it. Identity becomes a constellation of roles. And yet, culture does not define identity alone. It also creates tension. The individual self sometimes aligns with cultural expectations and sometimes resists them. This tension forms one of the most important challenges in identity development. When cultural norms align with a person's temperament, they feel at ease. When norms contradict a person's inner world, they feel conflict. This conflict can lead to conformity, rebellion, transformation, or deep self-reflection. Many of the struggles people face around gender, sexuality, career, belief, or lifestyle are rooted in cultural expectations that do not fit their internal identity. These struggles reveal an essential truth. Identity is shaped by culture, but it also transcends culture. Identity seeks authenticity. Culture can support authenticity or challenge it. It can illuminate a path or create obstacles. It can liberate or confine. The interplay between self and society becomes one of the most important journeys a person undertakes. If you gently soften your gaze or relax your shoulders, you may feel the presence of your own cultural shadows and lights. The beliefs you inherited without choosing, the roles you adopted, the expectations you absorbed. Identity is not born in a vacuum. It is born in a web of influences that stretch far beyond the self. Culture provides the canvas on which identity is painted. But every painting contains shadows, parts of the self that are pushed aside, hidden, or suppressed. These shadows hold forgotten memories, unexpressed emotions, and unresolved tensions. To understand identity fully, we must journey into the darker terrain of the self, the parts that do not fit easily into cultural narratives, the parts shaped by pain, fear, neglect, or conflict, the parts we avoid yet cannot escape. In the next chapter, we explore these hidden corners, the unconscious patterns that influence behavior, the dormant emotional seeds that shape identity from beneath awareness, the inner conflicts that become some of the most powerful forces in a person's life. We enter the realm of the shadow identity. We continue. The shadow identity. Every identity carries light and shadow. The light holds our strengths, achievements, joys, and the parts of ourselves we feel proud to show the world. The shadow holds everything we hide, everything we avoid, everything we suppress or refuse to acknowledge. Often because at some point in life it felt too painful, too dangerous, or too incompatible with the roles we were taught to play. The shadow identity is not a flaw. It is a natural part of being human. It is the accumulation of forgotten experiences, unspoken fears, unmet needs, and unexpressed parts of the self. It is the emotional archaeology buried beneath the narratives we consciously tell about who we are. The shadow is formed early. Imagine a child learning which feelings are welcomed and which are pushed away. If a child's fear evokes comfort, they learn to express vulnerability. If fear evokes frustration or dismissal, the child learns to hide it. If anger is met with understanding, it becomes manageable. If anger is punished, the child buries it. If joy is celebrated, the child learns to shine. If joy is ignored, they learn to keep it quiet. The shadow is made of emotions that were never fully allowed to breathe. These emotions do not disappear. They sink beneath awareness, where they continue influencing thoughts, relationships, and behaviors. A child who felt unseen may grow into an adult who overachieves to earn validation. A child who was shamed for expressing hurt may grow into an adult who feels numb in moments of vulnerability. A child who witnessed conflict may become an adult who avoids confrontation at all costs. The shadow carries these unspoken truths. If you pause for a moment, maybe feeling the quiet rise and fall of your breath, you may sense that your own shadow is not a distant concept. It lives in subtle reactions, tightening in the stomach at certain words, avoidance of certain memories, sudden defensiveness in conversations, or the sinking feeling when old fears flare unexpectedly. The shadow identity reveals itself through patterns, patterns of reaction, patterns of belief, patterns of relationships, patterns of self-criticism or self-sabotage. These patterns are not intentional. They arise from parts of the self that were shaped in moments of overwhelm or emotional confusion, moments the conscious mind learned to push aside. The unconscious mind remembers what the conscious mind tries to forget. The shadow also forms through trauma, whether big or small. Trauma is not defined only by catastrophic events. It can also arise from chronic misattunement, emotional neglect, isolation, or environments where it was unsafe to express vulnerability. Trauma creates protective layers in the psyche, layers that become part of identity long after the original wound has faded. A person may grow into adulthood with a confident exterior, while their shadow holds the belief, "I am not enough." Another may develop a calm, agreeable persona, while their shadow holds unrecognized anger. Another may appear self-reliant, while their shadow carries the longing to be cared for. Identity becomes a negotiation between what we show and what we hide. Culture also shapes the shadow. Every society has emotions it praises and emotions it discourages. Certain traits are rewarded, others are judged. Some parts of the self become acceptable, others become dangerous. These cultural norms push individuals to repress the aspects of identity that do not align with social expectations. What cannot be expressed becomes shadow. The shadow identity also contains the parts of ourselves we have not yet grown into. Creativity we abandoned, passions we suppressed, dreams we postponed out of fear, strengths we never exercised. The shadow is not only dark, it is also the reservoir of unlived potential. The shadow holds the future self as much as it holds the past self. Consider the person who has always wanted to speak boldly, but learned early on that their voice caused conflict. Their shadow holds the strength of expression waiting to be reclaimed. Or the person who longed for independence, but was raised in an environment of control. Their shadow holds autonomy. Or the person who wanted to pursue an artistic life, but felt pressure to choose stability. The shadow holds creativity. The shadow is a container of what was lost, what was silenced, and what was never given space to grow. Yet the shadow does not remain silent. It expresses itself indirectly, through dreams, through instinctive reactions, through conflicts in relationships, through impulses that feel foreign or surprising, through the inexplicable pull towards certain people or patterns. The shadow seeks expression, even when the conscious mind resists. When we encounter parts of ourselves that feel uncomfortable, jealousy, insecurity, fear, anger, desire, pride, vulnerability, these moments offer clues. They reveal edges of identity that the conscious self has not integrated. They reveal fragments of experience waiting to be acknowledged. If you allow your breath to soften for a moment, you may notice areas of your own life where your reactions feel disproportionate or mysterious. These are often invitations from the shadow, not punishments. Invitations, doorways to hidden truths. The shadow is not the enemy of identity. It is the missing piece. To ignore the shadow is to live with half a self. To integrate it is to become whole. Integration does not require reliving the past. It requires acknowledging the emotions, needs, and parts of the self that were once pushed out of awareness. It requires honesty, compassion, a willingness to see oneself with gentle clarity. When the shadow is integrated, identity becomes richer, more flexible, more authentic. The person becomes capable of navigating life with greater resilience. Their relationships deepen, their emotional world expands. Their choices align more closely with their true nature rather than with old defenses. The shadow, once feared, becomes a source of insight, strength, creativity, wisdom. Identity is not only what we present to the world, it is also what we reclaim from the places we once abandoned. It is the dance between the conscious and the unconscious, the known and the hidden, the accepted and the rejected. But identity is not fixed. It shifts across time and circumstance. It changes with experience, environment, age, and relationship. It adapts. It evolves. It reshapes itself again and again as life unfolds. In the next chapter, we explore this dynamic dimension, the fluidity of identity, how the self can change shape, soften, harden, dissolve, or reinvent itself across the years. How roles, environments, and life experiences continually revise the story of who we are. We continue. The fluid self. Identity is often imagined as something solid, a set of traits, beliefs, preferences, and memories that remain consistent across a lifetime. But in reality, identity is fluid. It ebbs and flows. It shifts with age, environment, relationship, challenge, and opportunity. It expands in some seasons and contracts in others. It evolves as we grow, learn, and shed old versions of ourselves. The self is not a single structure. It is a living process. From the moment we enter the world, we begin shaping an identity that will transform countless times. A child's identity gives way to the adolescence. The adolescent becomes the young adult. The young adult becomes the one who carries responsibility, who navigates independence, who builds relationships and futures. And later, identity softens again, reflecting wisdom, perspective, and the integration of life's many chapters. Identity is a river, not a stone. Imagine the self as a constellation of experiences. At any given time, some stars burn brightly. Roles, relationships, aspirations, emotions. Others dim or shift position. Some appear only in certain seasons. The constellation is recognizable, yet never identical from one moment to the next. We often feel we are the same person across time. But this sense of continuity is a story the mind tells to maintain coherence. In truth, the self you were 10 years ago is not the self you are now. Your preferences changed. Your fears changed. Your values evolved. Your relationships reshaped you. Your environment rewrote parts of you. Even your brain rewired itself through experience. Identity is the continuous negotiation between who you were, who you are, and who you are becoming. If you pause for a moment, perhaps noticing the gentle rise and fall of your breath, you may sense how your inner world has changed through the years. Memories once vivid have softened. Emotions once overwhelming have healed or transformed. Ideas you once held tightly may now feel distant. Each of these changes reflects the fluid nature of identity. Fluidity begins in childhood. A young child may see themselves as dependent, imaginative, curious. In adolescence, identity becomes more social. The adolescent self seeks belonging, recognition, autonomy. They experiment with clothing, music, friendships, interests. They shift between different versions of themselves, trying to find the one that feels most authentic. This experimentation is not confusion, it is exploration. Identity requires exploration in order to grow. Early adulthood brings new fluidity. Careers, relationships, independence, responsibility, all reshape identity. A person may feel confident in one environment and uncertain in another. They may feel bold in one role and timid in another. They may thrive in certain relationships and feel diminished in others. Environment interacts with internal patterns to create different expressions of identity. Identity is context-dependent. A person may be quiet at work, but expressive with close friends. They may be confident in creativity, but insecure in leadership. They may be nurturing in family life, yet reserved in public settings. These shifts are not contradictions. They are reflections of identity's adaptability. We contain multiple selves, each one emerging in different contexts. These selves are not false. They are facets of a greater whole. Throughout life, transitions reshape identity dramatically. A major move, a new job, the end of a relationship, the beginning of a new one. Loss, success, failure, illness, recovery, parenthood, aging. Every transition calls forth new qualities. Some qualities were always within us but remained dormant until the right moment arrived. Identity evolves through activation. The self does not remain unchanged when life changes. It responds, adapts, and reorganizes. In times of calm, identity may feel stable. In times of upheaval, identity can feel uncertain or fragmented. This fragmentation can be frightening, but it is also a natural part of growth. Breakdowns often precede breakthroughs. Identity must sometimes loosen before it can reform. Old narratives must dissolve to make space for new ones. Roles that once defined us may no longer fit. Dreams that once guided us may lose their meaning. This is not failure. It is evolution. The fluid self is also shaped by relationships. Every relationship draws out a different version of us. We feel one way with old friends, another with new ones. One way with mentors, another with children. One way with lovers, another with rivals. One way when we feel safe, another when we feel threatened. Relationships are mirrors that reveal hidden dimensions of identity. Some mirrors show us our strength. Others reveal vulnerability. Some reflect who we wish to be. Others reveal who we fear we are. These reflections shape how we understand ourselves and what we choose to become. Identity also contains cycles. There are times when the self contracts, seeking safety, familiarity, stability, and times when the self expands, seeking novelty, growth, transformation. These cycles reflect emotional rhythms. They reflect seasons of life. They reflect the interplay between self-protection and self-expression. No identity is static. Static identity is an illusion. People sometimes cling to a rigid sense of self. They say, "This is just who I am." But often, beneath this statement lies fear. The fear of change, the fear of losing something familiar, the fear of stepping into the unknown. Yet the self is designed to change. Its fluidity is part of its strength. When we resist identity's evolution, we suffer. When we allow it, we grow. Fluidity also extends to beliefs. Across a lifetime, beliefs shift as experiences deepen. A person may become more compassionate after loss, more humble after success, more open after challenge, more grounded after turbulence. Beliefs are not fixed structures. They are responses to lived reality. Identity grows through this ongoing revision. The self also contains contradictions. A person can be both brave and afraid, both independent and longing for connection, both logical and intuitive, both confident and insecure. Identity is not the removal of contradiction, but the ability to hold multiple truths at once. Contradiction is not confusion, it is complexity. The fluid self learns to navigate these complexities with increasing wisdom. It learns that identity can stretch without breaking, that selfhood is large enough to hold multitudes, that change is not a threat to the self, but a natural part of being alive. If you take a gentle breath, you may sense that within you lives not one self, but many selves shaped by childhood, adolescence, adulthood, by love and loss, by joy and disappointment, by culture, by memory, by possibility. Each self has contributed to the person you are now. Each will continue shaping the person you will become. Fluidity is not instability, it is evolution. Identity becomes richer as it learns to move, to shift, to adapt with grace, to release what no longer fits, to embrace what feels true, to rewrite old stories, to step into new forms. As identity becomes more flexible, something extraordinary becomes possible. A deeper understanding of the brain itself, the biological engine behind the self's evolution. To understand the fluid self fully, we must enter the neural landscape, the network of systems, circuits, and patterns that create the ongoing simulation of I. In the next chapter, we step into the neuroscience of identity. We explore the brain's default mode network, the architecture of introspection, the neural basis of self-awareness, and the extraordinary biological foundation of the self. We continue. The neuroscience of self. Identity is not just a story or a psychological construct. It is also a biological phenomenon, an emergent property of billions of neurons connecting, communicating, reshaping themselves across a lifetime. Within the quiet, intricate folds of the brain, identity takes form. It is sculpted through electrical pulses, chemical exchanges, neural networks, and the constant flow of sensory experience. The self is a living simulation, a dynamic model the brain builds and updates moment by moment. To understand identity fully, we must step into the neural architecture that makes this simulation possible. Imagine looking at the brain not as an organ, but as a galaxy. 86 billion neurons, trillions of connections, entire networks lighting up like constellations. Some networks process sounds, others process memories, others regulate emotion, others navigate space, language, vision, and movement. And then, scattered across these networks, are the circuits that create the sense of self. One of the most important is the default mode network. This network becomes active when the mind is not focused on external tasks, during daydreaming, during introspection, during imagination, during self-reflection. It is the neural birthplace of the inner narrative. When you think about your past, imagine your future, evaluate your choices, or wonder who you are, the default mode network hums quietly in the background, weaving thoughts into coherence. It is the neural storyteller. The default mode network connects regions responsible for memory, emotional meaning, spatial perspective, and internal awareness. These regions collaborate to create a stable simulation of me. Not a fixed me, but a coherent one that feels continuous across time, despite the constant changes happening in the body and brain. If you pause and gently notice the sensations in your body, you may sense the quiet hum of this network, the presence behind the eyes, the subtle awareness of being a person listening to a story. This presence is not an illusion, it is a neural achievement. But the self is not created by one network alone. Identity is distributed across many interconnected systems. The salience network determines what matters, what captures attention, what feels urgent, what needs to be addressed. Without it, the brain would drown in endless information. The salience network acts like a spotlight, selecting which experiences become part of the self and which fade into the background. Emotion networks shape the self through feeling. The amygdala assigns significance to events: fear, threat, safety, reward. The limbic system stores emotional memories. These memories become part of identity, influencing behavior long after the original experience has passed. The autobiographical memory system transforms isolated moments into personal narratives. The insular cortex creates interoception, the ability to sense the internal state of the body. Interoception anchors identity in physical sensation: hunger, heartbeat, tension, breath. These sensations form the foundation of embodied self-awareness. Identity is not only cognitive, it is physical. It lives in the body as much as in the mind. Even the motor system contributes to identity. When a person learns to walk, speak, dance, or perform skilled movements, these patterns become part of their embodied identity. A musician's fingers remember melodies. A dancer's body remembers motion. A craftsman's hands remember tools. These forms of embodied memory shape who they become, often without words. The neural basis of identity also depends on prediction. The brain is constantly predicting what will happen next. It anticipates sensory inputs, emotional reactions, and social responses. This predictive processing creates a sense of stability. When predictions match reality, the self feels coherent. When they mismatch, the self feels disrupted. Identity is, in many ways, the brain's best guess about what is happening inside and outside the body. The brain must constantly integrate sensory information with memory, emotion, and context. It must decide whether experiences belong to the present self, the past self, or the future self. This integration requires intricate coordination between brain regions. The prefrontal cortex, hippocampus, posterior cingulate cortex, and others. Together, these systems allow a person to say, "I am the one who lived that moment," even if the body has changed entirely since then. Memory plays a central role. Without memory, identity collapses. Episodic memory allows us to remember specific moments. Semantic memory stores facts about our lives. Procedural memory stores skills. Emotional memory stores the meaning of past experiences. All these systems collaborate to create a stable sense of who we are. The brain also constructs identity through social cognition. The medial prefrontal cortex processes information about ourselves and others. The temporoparietal junction helps us infer other people's thoughts and intentions. These networks allow humans to understand their place within a social world. They allow us to reflect on how others see us. This reflection shapes identity as powerfully as inner experience. Identity is both internal and relational. It exists within us and between us. Another crucial part of identity is the brain's capacity for metacognition, thinking about thinking. Humans can observe their own thoughts. They can notice when their minds wander. They can reflect on their choices. This ability allows the self to evolve consciously. Metacognition enables the self to change itself. If you take a gentle breath now, you may sense a subtle shift in awareness. The part of you noticing your own thoughts. This observer is not separate from you. It is a function of your brain. Yet it feels like an elevated perspective, a quieter vantage point from which identity can be studied, revised, or gently transformed. Neuroscientists have also discovered that the sense of self is not constant. The brain shifts between modes. During focused tasks, the sense of self dissolves. During flow states, identity becomes quiet, absorbed in action. During meditation, the boundaries of the self soften. Identity becomes spacious, less rigid, more fluid. These experiences reveal that the self is not a fixed entity, but a fluctuating process. The brain continually rebuilds identity moment by moment. Even our sense of agency, the feeling that we are the authors of our actions, is constructed by neural systems evaluating intention, movement, and outcome. When these systems align, we feel in control. When they misalign, we feel disconnected from our own actions. This delicate dance shapes how confident, capable, or uncertain we feel. Identity is the result of countless neural processes working together in harmony, often without our awareness. The neuroscience of identity shows that the self is not found in any single region of the brain. It is a collaboration among networks, memories, sensations, and predictions. A pattern rather than a place. A process rather than a thing. And yet, for all the biological complexity, identity still carries a profound mystery. The brain can explain mechanisms, but it cannot fully explain the subjective experience of being a self, the richness of inner life, the quiet sense of presence, the feeling of I am. To understand identity at its deepest level, we must step beyond biology. We must enter the realm of philosophy, the place where cultures, thinkers, and spiritual traditions have asked for centuries what it means to be a self. What consciousness truly is. What remains when we peel back all layers of biology, memory, and story. In the next chapter, we explore these timeless questions: the philosophical self, the essence beneath the narratives, the mystery that science can describe but not fully define. We continue. The philosophical self. The search for identity does not end with biology. It deepens. It reaches beyond neurons, beyond memory, beyond culture, into the quiet terrain of human consciousness, where every person, at some point in life, asks questions that science alone cannot answer. What am I? Why am I the one looking out through these eyes? What is the self beneath thoughts, emotions, and experiences? Where does identity truly begin, and where does it end? These questions are ancient. They echo through philosophy, spirituality, mythology, and the innermost reflections of people across history. While neuroscience reveals how the self is constructed, philosophy asks what the self is, or whether it even exists in the way we imagine. Identity, when viewed through a philosophical lens, becomes a profound exploration into the nature of existence itself. Imagine sitting alone in a quiet room. No distractions, no roles, no responsibilities, just you and your awareness. If you close your eyes, you might notice the flow of thoughts drifting like clouds, emotions rising and falling like waves, sensations shifting through the body. All of these experiences change moment by moment. Yet something remains, a silent observer, a presence that does not come and go, a sense of I am, even when the content of experience changes. What is this presence? Where does it reside? Is it the brain's simulation? Is it something deeper, something more fundamental? Philosophers across cultures approached these questions with different insights. In ancient India, thinkers described the self as layered. The outer layers, physical, emotional, mental, shift constantly. But beneath these layers lies Atman, the witnessing consciousness, something changeless within the changing world. Identity, in this view, is both temporal and eternal. In ancient Greece, philosophers like Socrates and Plato believed that the examined life reveals the true self, that reflection, reason, and moral insight refine identity. The self becomes a journey toward wisdom. In Chinese philosophy, the self is relational. a fluid expression of harmony with the world. Identity is shaped through balance, virtue, and connection, rather than through isolated introspection. The self is a dynamic process, not a fixed entity. In Buddhism, the self is an illusion, an ever-changing collection of sensations, thoughts, memories, and conditions. Nothing remains the same from moment to moment. Clinging to a fixed identity creates suffering, while recognizing the impermanence of all things brings freedom. In modern existentialism, the self is not discovered, it is created. Humans are free to shape their own identity through choices, actions, and meaning-making. Existence precedes essence. We become ourselves through living, not through predetermined nature. Across these philosophies, one truth emerges. Identity is not singular. It is multi-layered, paradoxical, mysterious, alive. If you pause now and gently feel the breath rise and fall, you may sense this truth. The part of you that notices the breath is not the same as the breath. The part of you that observes thoughts is not the same as the thoughts. The observer is not easily defined or captured. The philosophical self is difficult to articulate because it extends beyond words. Words describe objects, emotions, memories, but the self that experiences these things is not an object. It is the experiencer, the open space in which experience happens. Identity becomes the meeting point between the known and the unknowable. Consider the idea of continuity. You feel that you are the same person you were yesterday, even though every cell in your body is changing, every memory is slightly rewritten, and your brain is constantly updating its internal model of reality. This continuity is not physical, it is experiential. A thread woven through perception, memory, and consciousness. Philosophers ask, is this continuity real or imagined? Is identity something we discover or something we create? Is the I a stable entity or a convenient story? Science can map neural networks, but it cannot fully explain why experience feels unified, why consciousness feels like a single field rather than a scattered collection of processes, why the self feels like a center, even though neuroscience finds no physical center. This mystery has inspired countless theories. Some propose that identity is the brain's attempt to create coherence, that the self is a narrative woven to maintain psychological stability, a story told so convincingly that we forget it is a story. Others argue that consciousness itself is fundamental, that the observing self is not an illusion, but the ground of all experience, that identity is the way consciousness expresses itself through a human life. Still others say identity is relational. The self is not a thing, but a process arising in the space between organisms, environments, and cultures. Each view reveals something true. Identity is a story, constructed, updated, revised. Identity is an experience, felt, lived, embodied. Identity is relational, shaped by others, by society, by history. Identity is mysterious, an awareness that cannot be reduced to mechanisms alone. This layered nature of identity reveals how complex the self truly is. You are a biological organism, a psychological being, a cultural expression, a narrative creation, a conscious presence, all at once. The philosophical self asks us to consider each layer, not to choose one, but to understand how they interact, how they shape the felt experience of being human. Identity becomes a living question rather than a fixed answer. If you soften your attention again, perhaps feeling the quiet space between thoughts, you may notice that the self is not something you hold. It is something you are. Not an object, but an unfolding. Not a definition, but an experience, a process, a mystery you inhabit every day. And yet, identity does not remain only in philosophy or contemplation. Humanity now stands on the edge of a new frontier. A transformation unlike anything that came before. Technology, digital environments, artificial intelligence, and new forms of connection are reshaping identity in profound ways. The self is entering an era where boundaries blur, where physical and virtual lives merge, where memory, agency, and presence evolve, where identity may extend beyond the biological and into new dimensions. In the next chapter, we explore this future, the frontier where humanity meets technology, where the self becomes something we have not yet fully imagined, where identity evolves once again into possibilities as vast as the human imagination. We continue. The future of identity. Identity has never been static. It has evolved from the earliest boundaries in ancient oceans to the emotional landscapes of mammals, from the birth of language to the intricate narratives of modern consciousness. But now, it stands on the edge of a new transformation. A shift not rooted in biology or ancient culture, but in technology, virtualization, and the rewriting of human experience in real time. The future of identity will not simply expand what we know. It will redefine what it means to be someone. To see this future clearly, imagine the present moment. A world where digital life is woven into daily existence, where people maintain online personas alongside physical ones, where friendships form through screens, where emotions travel through text, where memory is stored not only in the brain but in servers, where presence extends into virtual spaces. Humans already navigate multiple identities: professional, personal, digital, social, intimate, each one shaped by environment and context. Technology has made identity more fluid than ever. But this is only the beginning. The next decades will bring changes that challenge the very boundaries of selfhood. These transformations will come from several converging forces. Digital selves. Today, people curate online identities through social media, gaming platforms, avatars, and digital expressions. These identities can be idealized, exaggerated, or exploratory. They allow people to try on versions of themselves that may feel unsafe or impossible in physical life. In virtual spaces, shyness can be shed, confidence can be practiced, creativity can flourish without social constraint. People become storytellers of their own image. These digital selves are not fake, they are experiments in identity. They reveal desires, fears, and possibilities hidden beneath social norms. As virtual reality evolves, these digital identities will become richer, more embodied, more immersive. People may spend significant portions of life in virtual environments, working, creating, learning, socializing. Identity will expand to include multiple modes of being, each with its own behaviors, relationships, and emotional landscapes, augmented minds. Identity evolves through memory, emotion, and cognitive ability. Technology is beginning to interact with each of these domains. Memory, once fragile and unreliable, can now be captured externally. Photos, videos, notes, cloud storage. We outsource parts of our identity via digital systems. In the future, neural interfaces may allow memories to be stored, enhanced, or retrieved in new ways. This raises profound questions. If memories can be modified, who is the I that remembers? If emotions can be regulated through technology, who is the I that feels? If cognition can be augmented, who is the I that thinks. Neural augmentation may expand intelligence, creativity, and emotional balance, but it may also reshape identity. The self could become a hybrid of biology and technology. The boundary between mind and machine may blur. Artificial companions. Artificial intelligence is evolving into something more relational. People already form emotional bonds with digital assistants, AI friends, characters in games, and online communities. In the future, AI may become deeply integrated into human identity, not as replacements for human connection, but as extensions of personal experience. AI companions might help individuals reflect on emotions, develop new skills, or explore hidden aspects of themselves. They may become mirrors of the psyche, tools for self-discovery. They may hold memories, preferences, and emotional histories, providing continuity across digital and physical worlds. But this raises a question. If an AI knows your history, remembers your patterns, understands your emotions, how does it shape your identity? Does it become part of the self? Does it hold pieces of your consciousness? Identity becomes distributed across relationships, human and non-human. Virtual mortality and digital continuity. In the far future, people may create digital versions of themselves, constructed from memories, writing, images, speech patterns, and behavior. These versions could exist long after physical death, becoming echoes of identity passed down through generations. This continuity challenges traditional notions of self. If a digital version of you continues to learn, speak, and evolve, is it still you? Or is it a new identity built from your foundation? The boundary between self and legacy becomes porous. Global culture and identity fusion. As the digital world links billions of people across borders, cultural identity becomes more fluid. Traditions blend, values mix, ideas travel at the speed of light. People adopt multiple cultural influences, creating hybrid identities. You may be shaped by your birthplace, but also by global communities, artists, thinkers, creators, mentors, and digital tribes. Identity becomes layered with global meaning. People may belong to several cultural worlds simultaneously. The ethical self. The future will force humanity to confront new ethical questions. Who are we when our memories can be shaped? Who are we when our decisions are influenced by algorithms? Who are we when virtual experiences feel as real as physical ones? Who are we when identity becomes editable? Ethics becomes central to identity. Individuals must choose how technology integrates into their sense of self. The future self is not just a product of biological evolution, it is a product of conscious design, the unchanging core. And yet, even as identity becomes more fluid, more layered, more distributed, something essential remains. A presence that persists across transformation, a sense of being, a consciousness witnessing experience. This core may shift in expression, but it feels stable beneath the flux. If you gently notice your breath again, the quiet rhythm, the softening of the body, you may feel the simple truth of presence. This presence is the ground of identity, even as everything around it evolves. Technology may expand identity, but it cannot replace the felt experience of being. Virtual selves may multiply, but each one is rooted in the awareness that gives life meaning. Augmented minds may shift how we think, but they cannot eliminate the mystery of consciousness. Identity will stretch into the future, but it will still be carried by the same simple truth. We are beings aware of being. We are stories living themselves. We are presence moving through time. As we come to the end of this exploration, one final chapter remains. A closing reflection. Quiet, spacious, grounding. A return to the simple essence of the self after a journey through biology, memory, emotion, culture, mind, and the unknown future. We continue. Closing reflection. The journey of identity is vast. It stretches across billions of years, from the earliest cells drifting through ancient oceans to the complex, emotional, social, and reflective beings we are today. It spans every layer of human experience: biology, sensation, memory, emotion, relationship, story, culture, the unconscious, imagination, and the vast architectures of the brain. To understand identity is to understand the story of life itself. We began with the first self, a fragile membrane separating the inner world from the outer, a tiny spark declaring, "This is me, this is not me." From that spark came sensation. From sensation, memory. From memory, experience. From experience, emotion. From emotion, relationship. From relationship, the social mind. From the social mind, the narrative self. From narrative, culture. From culture, meaning. From meaning, reflection. And from reflection, the profound awareness that we exist. Identity emerged not all at once, but layer by layer. It was shaped by evolution, shaped by family, shaped by environment, shaped by language, shaped by story. It became a constellation of experiences, always in motion, always adjusting, always reaching toward coherence, even in the midst of change. If you take a gentle breath, you might feel the presences of your own identity rising softly to the surface. The story of who you are, shaped by childhood, sculpted by emotion, filled with memories and dreams, strengthened by challenges, softened by love, and always evolving. The truth is simple, yet profound. You are not one self. You are many selves across time, a flowing river, not a fixed stone. The child you once were still lives within you. The adolescent who dreamed or feared still whispers. The adult you are becoming continues to unfold. The future self waits quietly in possibility. Identity is the ongoing dialogue between these selves, the ever-changing story narrated by the mind and felt by the body. The quiet continuity that says, "I am the one who lived this life, even as everything else transforms." You have walked through the ancient origins of selfhood, through the rise of awareness and emotion, through the mirrors of social life, through the power of language and memory, through the shaping forces of childhood, through the emergence of ego, the influence of culture, the depth of the shadow, and the fluidity of growth, through the neural landscapes that create the inner world, through philosophy's timeless questions, through the frontier of identity's future. And now here you are, breathing, present, aware. Identity is not something you must chase. It is something you witness as it unfolds within you, moment by moment, experience by experience, choice by choice. Your identity is not a fixed conclusion. It is a living conversation, a story written in real time, a bridge between what has been and what might be. There will be days when your identity feels clear, days when it feels uncertain, days when it stretches, breaks, reforms, or surprises you. Each of these moments is part of the path. You are a work in progress, a mosaic of past and present, a constellation of memory and possibility, a being capable of change, growth, reflection, and renewal. As you soften your attention and allow the breath to settle, notice the quiet truth beneath all stories. The awareness that remains, steady and open. The simple presence of being here, alive, conscious, experiencing existence from within. This presence is the deepest layer of identity. It does not come and go. It does not depend on roles, achievements, or beliefs. It simply is. The birth of identity is not a single moment in time. It is an ongoing creation, a lifelong unfolding. Every chapter of your life, every joy, struggle, connection, and transformation continues this creation. You are the author. You are the character. You are the witness. You are the becoming. And the story continues.